Europe in 1918 was financially broken. The war had ended, but the continent wasn't celebrating. It was bankrupt, exhausted, and on the verge of economic collapse. The financial cost of World War I was staggering, so enormous that it can't even be properly described with ordinary numbers. Governments, banks, and ordinary citizens were all ruined. Countries that had once been rich and powerful, like Britain and France, had drained their treasuries to fund the war. They had sold off foreign investments, borrowed massive sums, and printed currency in a desperate attempt to pay for a conflict that had lasted for years longer than anyone expected. In short, the financial world of Europe was in ruins, and the United States quietly became the world's new economic center. The scale of the financial hemorrhage is hard to imagine. Take Britain, for example. In 1914, London was the undisputed financial capital of the world. It had colonies, trade networks, and a banking system that funded much of the globe. But by 1918, Britain had borrowed billions from the United States and liquidated huge amounts of its international assets. Every gold reserve was spent. Every overseas investment was sold at fire sale prices. The country had mortgaged its future to pay for the present. France, similarly, had spent its economy on the war. Cities had been destroyed, factories ruined, farms trampled, and millions of soldiers killed. Tax revenue had collapsed. The government owed massive debts to foreign banks and its own citizens. Both nations emerged from the war with enormous debts and nothing tangible to show for it. The glory of victory came at the cost of near financial extinction. Germany's financial collapse was even more dramatic. By 1918, the German economy was shattered. The country had funded its war effort almost entirely through borrowing and printing money. Industrial production had been diverted almost entirely to munitions and military supplies. Civilian needs were neglected. Food shortages, inflation, and unemployment had skyrocketed. By the end of the war, Germany owed enormous sums to both domestic creditors and foreign governments, though it had lost its ability to pay. Its economy was so weak that even before the Treaty of Versailles added reparations on top of wartime debt, it was teetering on total collapse. The result of this continental financial suicide was global. Europe could no longer finance its own recovery, and countries like Britain and France became heavily dependent on loans from across the Atlantic. The United States, which had entered the war late but had maintained its industrial and agricultural capacity, stepped in as the world's new creditor. American banks provided massive loans to rebuild Europe. The U.S. had been a latecomer to the war, but emerged as the dominant economic power almost overnight. London and Paris had once dictated the flow of capital around the world. Now Wall Street called the shots. The balance of global financial power had shifted dramatically, and it was unlikely Europe would ever regain its pre-war economic supremacy. On top of massive borrowing, European governments had also relied on printing money to fund the war effort. The consequences of this strategy were catastrophic, particularly in Germany and Austria-Hungary. Currency values collapsed, prices skyrocketed, and ordinary citizens suffered the brunt of economic collapse. Workers saw their wages become worthless almost overnight. Savings disappeared. Middle-class families who had prudently saved for decades watched everything vanish. What was supposed to be a temporary emergency measure turned into a long-term economic disaster. The financial infrastructure of Europe was literally destabilized, with entire economies teetering on the edge of collapse. The war also destroyed infrastructure and industrial capacity across the continent, making economic recovery even more difficult. Factories that had produced consumer goods were destroyed, converted into military production, or left abandoned. Railroads, ports, and roads had been heavily bombarded or used for troop movement, leaving them in terrible condition. The destruction of farmland in Belgium, northern France, and Eastern Europe meant food production was devastated. Even if money had been available, Europe didn't have the resources or production capacity to rebuild quickly. In practical terms, millions of soldiers returning from the front found a continent that could not sustain them financially, industrially, or agriculturally. The financial collapse also created political instability. When a country cannot pay its debts or provide for its citizens, social unrest follows. Strikes, riots, and revolutions erupted across Europe in the immediate post-war years. Germany experienced the collapse of the monarchy and the creation of the Weimar Republic, a fragile government struggling to manage a society in chaos. Austria-Hungary dissolved into multiple small nations, each facing its own financial nightmare. Russia had already experienced revolution, and the new Soviet state struggled to maintain any financial stability. In this way, the economic devastation of the war-fed political crises and revolutionary movements destabilizing Europe for decades. One of the most striking aspects of Europe's financial collapse was how interconnected it had become. The war had required coordination across national economies. Nations had borrowed from each other, from foreign banks, and from their own citizens. This meant that the collapse of one economy had ripple effects everywhere else. When Germany began struggling to pay its debts, the banks of Britain, France, and the United States were affected. When Britain's economy slowed due to war debts and reconstruction needs, colonial trade suffered. The financial shockwaves of the Great War were felt globally, highlighting how fragile the European economic system had become. Even ordinary citizens were affected on a scale that was unprecedented. Inflation and shortages meant that families struggled to feed themselves, clothe their children, and find shelter. Millions faced unemployment and poverty. The social contract between governments and citizens, already strained by 4 years of wartime hardship, broke down in many places. People looked to their leaders for solutions, but the financial tools simply did not exist. Governments were bankrupt. Banks were overloaded. There was no money, no infrastructure, and no way to meet basic needs. The entire population experienced a harsh lesson. War is not free, and the price is paid far beyond the battlefield. By the time the Treaty of Versailles was signed and reparations were imposed on Germany, the financial situation worsened dramatically. Reparations added billions of dollars in extra obligations to a country already crippled by war spending. These payments were not just abstract numbers, they represented real economic pressure on German industry, labor, and citizens. The debts to the United States, coupled with Versailles reparations, created a situation where Germany was caught between impossible obligations. Economic desperation became a breeding ground for political extremism, social unrest, and eventually the conditions that would lead to World War II. This is why the post-war financial collapse is not just a story of economics. It is a story of history repeating itself. In sum, Europe after World War I was like a man who had borrowed from every friend, sold his possessions, and burned his savings, only to find that the war had cost more than anyone imagined. The continent had shot itself in the wallet, destroyed the infrastructure that made money possible, and weakened its own position globally. Meanwhile, the United States had quietly become the world's financial powerhouse, a shift that would have consequences for decades. Europe's financial suicide ensured that even peace could not be stable, and recovery would take years, decades in some cases, to even approach the level of prosperity it had once enjoyed. If you're following along, don't forget to hit like. Leave a comment to tell the algorithm you care. And subscribe to Dumb Historians so you don't miss the next part of this breakdown of Europe's post-war catastrophe. Europe after World War I was not just financially broken, it was demographically shattered. The war had killed nearly 10 million soldiers, wounded over 20 million more, and left countless others physically or psychologically scarred. This massive loss of life created what historians often call the demographic void. Countries across the continent suddenly found themselves missing an entire generation of young men, and the social and economic consequences of that absence were profound. Entire communities, villages, and cities faced labor shortages, disrupted family structures, and the collapse of traditional societal norms. The most immediate effect of the demographic void was the shortage of workers. Millions of men of working age, the very backbone of the labor force, had been sent to the front and never returned. Farms, factories, and mines that had been dependent on male labor suddenly lacked the people needed to operate efficiently. Crops rotted in the fields, industrial production slowed, and economic recovery became even more difficult. The absence of so many young men forced governments and private enterprises to adapt quickly, often in ways that were untested and difficult. Women, who had traditionally been confined to domestic work or low-paying service jobs, were thrust into roles previously dominated by men. In factories, railways, and offices, women became essential to the functioning of the economy. This shift was not simply a stopgap. It was a fundamental transformation of the social order. In many countries, women gained new skills, independence, and public visibility. In Britain and France, for example, women operated munitions factories, managed transportation networks, and took administrative roles in government and commerce. This shift accelerated long-term social changes, including the push for women's suffrage and broader labor rights. Because society had now seen firsthand that women could handle responsibilities that had been considered the exclusive domain of men, the loss of so many men also caused a significant decline in birth rates, further compounding the demographic crisis. With millions of potential fathers killed, population growth slowed dramatically in the immediate post-war years. This decline had long-term consequences for economies and societies. Fewer births meant a smaller future workforce, reduced consumer demand, and long-term challenges for social welfare systems, which relied on the next generation to support the old. For countries already struggling with economic collapse, this demographic shift made rebuilding even more complicated. The psychological impact of the demographic void cannot be overstated. Survivors returned home, carrying the invisible wounds of war shell shock, physical disability, and trauma. Families grieved the loss of sons, brothers, and husbands, often without closure or understanding of the magnitude of what had happened. In towns across Europe, streets once filled with the laughter and energy of young men were eerily quiet. Their absence felt in every aspect of daily life. The emotional toll on women and children who survived was immense. Widows had to manage households alone, often while working outside the home, and children grew up without fathers, creating long-term social stress and reshaping family dynamics. The demographic void also had profound political consequences. Governments faced pressure to address the needs of widows, orphans, and disabled veterans, often while lacking the financial resources to do so. In Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia, the loss of large numbers of men contributed to political instability, fueling revolutionary movements and social unrest. The weakened labor force and diminished population meant that strikes, protests, and political radicalization became more frequent and impactful. Governments were forced to make difficult choices, balancing economic recovery with social stability, all under the shadow of a lost generation. The void also reshaped cultural norms and societal expectations. In literature, art, and philosophy, the war's toll on humanity became a central theme. Writers and thinkers struggled to make sense of the death and suffering, creating a cultural reflection of the demographic crisis. Poetry, novels, and paintings frequently portrayed the absence of men and the impact on society, highlighting both the personal and collective consequences of the war. Memorials and monuments rose across Europe, not only to commemorate the dead, but also to serve as a constant reminder of the scale of loss and the void left behind. Economically, the demographic void meant that governments and businesses had to innovate to cope with labor shortages. In some cases, this led to mechanization and increased reliance on technology to replace missing workers. In agriculture, tractors and machinery became essential as farms could no longer rely solely on human labor. In factories, assembly lines and automation allowed production to continue despite fewer workers. While this modernization would benefit economies in the long term, it was forced and uneven, leaving many communities struggling to adapt in the immediate aftermath of the war. The void also had geographic consequences. Entire regions in France and Belgium, where battles had been most intense, were depopulated with villages left half empty or abandoned. Infrastructure in these areas was destroyed, compounding the problem. The land itself, once farmed by local communities, could not be utilized effectively without labor. Governments faced the additional burden of resettling populations, rebuilding towns, and re-establishing agriculture in areas devastated by both battle and population loss. The demographic crisis was therefore intertwined with economic and environmental recovery. Socially, the demographic void accelerated shifts in class structure and gender roles. The traditional patriarchal model was disrupted as women gained new independence and authority. Young men who survived the war often returned with a sense of disillusionment, rejecting the old societal expectations that had led them to fight. This disillusionment fueled new cultural movements, including the lost generation in literature and art, which reflected the emptiness left by those who had perished. The psychological and social impact of the demographic void, therefore, extended far beyond the immediate economic consequences. Immigration patterns also shifted due to the void. Some countries encouraged migration to fill labor shortages, bringing in workers from other regions or colonies. For example, Britain saw increased migration from its colonies to fill industrial and agricultural roles. These movements created new cultural dynamics and social tensions as native populations adjusted to the presence of new communities. Migration was both a solution to the immediate labor crisis and a driver of long-term demographic and cultural change. The scale of the demographic void also affected military planning for the future. With so many young men dead or incapacitated, European powers had to reconsider conscription, training, and military recruitment for decades. The war had destroyed not just the current generation of soldiers, but also disrupted the pipeline of military leadership and experience. Countries were forced to rebuild their militaries from a depleted and traumatized population. Shaping defense strategies and political decisions in the interwar period, the demographic void was a continent-wide phenomenon, but its effects were uneven. Countries that had been battlegrounds, like France and Belgium, were hardest hit. Germany faced not only military defeat, but a loss of a significant portion of its male population, in both the army and subsequent civil unrest. Russia, having undergone revolution and civil war, also lost millions to both combat and famine. These uneven effects created a patchwork of demographic and economic stress across Europe, complicating coordinated recovery efforts. In conclusion, the great demographic void of World War I was one of the most profound and long-lasting consequences of the conflict. It reshaped society, disrupted economies, altered gender roles, and created political instability. The loss of millions of young men, the decline in birth rates, and the widespread trauma forced Europe to adapt in ways that would influence generations to come. Recovery was not just a matter of rebuilding cities or infrastructure. It was about rebuilding an entire society, a generation, and the workforce that had been decimated by the horrors of modern industrial warfare. World War I did not just kill millions and bankrupt entire countries, it erased empires. By the end of the conflict, the map of Europe had much of the Middle East looked nothing like it had before. 1914. The war shattered four major dynasties that had ruled for centuries: the Romanovs in Russia, the Hohenzollerns in Germany, the Habsburgs in Austria-Hungary, and the Ottomans in Turkey. These were not minor changes. These collapses uprooted centuries of political, social, and military structures, creating a vacuum that governments, economies, and ordinary people struggled to fill for decades. In Russia, the Romanov dynasty, which had ruled for over 3 centuries, collapsed under the strain of war. The massive casualties, economic collapse, and general discontent among soldiers and civilians triggered the February Revolution of 1917. The Tsar, Nicholas II, abdicated, ending centuries of autocratic rule. The collapse of the Romanovs was not just a dynastic failure, it marked the beginning of radical political change. The Bolsheviks seized power later that year, establishing a communist state that would last until 1991. This sudden political transformation reshaped Russia internally and threatened the rest of Europe as revolutionary ideas began to spread. Frightening monarchies and conservative governments across the continent, Germany faced a similar fate. The Hohenzollern dynasty, led by Kaiser Wilhelm II, crumbled in the face of military defeat and widespread civil unrest. The war had drained the German economy, devastated its population, and undermined the public's confidence in the monarchy. By November 1918, revolutionary uprisings in Berlin forced Wilhelm II to abdicate, ending centuries of imperial rule. The German Empire gave way to the Weimar Republic, a fragile democracy struggling to stabilize a nation crushed by debt, reparations, and the psychological shock of defeat. The sudden fall of the Hohenzollerns illustrated how military failure and domestic unrest could accelerate the end of even deeply entrenched regimes. Austria-Hungary, a complex patchwork of ethnicities and regions, suffered one of the most dramatic collapses. The Habsburg dynasty, which had ruled the sprawling empire for hundreds of years, could not survive the strain of total war. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was an unwieldy collection of ethnic groups, many of whom were eager for self-determination. By the war's end in 1918, nationalist movements within Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and other regions declared independence. The empire dissolved completely, leaving behind a new political landscape defined by fragile nation-states, border disputes, and ethnic tension. The fall of the Habsburgs showed how war could magnify internal divisions and accelerate the breakdown of even the most established political systems. The Ottoman Empire, known as the sick man of Europe, was already weakened before 1914. Its participation in World War III, on the side of the Central Powers, only accelerated its decline. Military defeat, internal strife, and nationalist uprisings within its territories hastened the empire's collapse. By 1922, the Sultanate was abolished, and Mustafa Kemal Ataturk led the establishment of the modern Republic of Turkey. The disintegration of the Ottoman Empire had far-reaching consequences beyond Anatolia. Former territories in the Middle East, including Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine, were placed under European mandates, primarily controlled by Britain and France, setting the stage for decades of political instability and conflict. The collapse of these empires did not occur in isolation. They were interconnected through alliances, trade, and shared borders. The simultaneous fall of multiple dynasties caused ripple effects throughout Europe. Monarchies that had survived centuries of change were suddenly forced to confront revolutionary movements, nationalist uprisings, and social unrest. Countries that had once been allies or adversaries suddenly faced entirely new neighbors, governments, and populations with competing claims and unresolved grievances. The entire European order was rewritten in a matter of months. The treaties that followed the war, especially the Treaty of Versailles, formalized this new political map. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was partitioned into Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. Germany lost territory to Belgium, France, Poland, and Denmark. The Ottoman lands were divided into mandates under British and French control. While these treaties aimed to establish stability, they often ignored the complex realities on the ground. Ethnic minorities were left stranded in new countries, borders were drawn hastily, and historical rivalries were inflamed. The result was a fragile, unstable Europe that would struggle with political and social upheaval for decades. The human consequences of the imperial collapse were immense. Millions of people found themselves suddenly citizens of new states, with new governments, new laws, and new identities imposed upon them. Soldiers returning from the front often discovered that their hometowns were no longer part of the same country, creating confusion, displacement, and resentment. Refugee crises emerged across Eastern Europe and the Middle East as populations were forced to flee political instability or ethnic persecution. The collapse of empires directly contributed to one of the largest population displacements in modern history up to that point. The economic effects were equally dramatic. Imperial economies had been centralized and interconnected, relying on long-standing trade networks and administrative systems. When the empires fell, these systems were disrupted. Taxes, tariffs, and trade agreements were suddenly obsolete, leaving economies fragmented and inefficient. Industries dependent on imperial markets collapsed. Infrastructure projects were halted, and governments struggled to collect revenue. Inflation, unemployment, and poverty surged in the post-war years, creating conditions for social unrest and political radicalization. Culturally, the collapse of empires caused a profound identity crisis. People who had once identified with a multi-ethnic empire now had to navigate the realities of nationhood. Languages, religions, and traditions became central to newly defined national identities, but they also became sources of tension. Minority groups often felt marginalized or persecuted, while majority populations struggled to establish legitimacy and cohesion in newly formed states. This cultural dislocation added another layer of difficulty to the already challenging task of rebuilding society after the war. The collapse of the imperial map also reshaped military strategies and alliances. The new states were often militarily weak, lacking experienced officers, supplies, and cohesive forces. Old alliances dissolved, and new regional conflicts emerged as neighboring countries jostled for influence and security. Military planners now had to consider a continent fragmented into multiple small, fragile states, rather than dealing with a few powerful empires. The strategic environment in Europe had shifted entirely, setting the stage for instability that would culminate in World War II, even beyond Europe. The collapse of empires reverberated globally. Colonial possessions were reassigned, mandates were established, and imperial influence was redistributed. European powers that had once dominated global trade and politics faced new challenges managing overseas territories, while local populations in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia saw the beginnings of nationalist movements inspired by the fall of old regimes in Europe. The end of empires in Europe accelerated global political transformation, demonstrating how interconnected power structures could be upended by total war. The collapse of the imperial map also had psychological effects. Populations that had lived under dynastic rule for centuries suddenly faced uncertainty and fear. For many, the collapse represented not just political instability, but a rupture in the familiar social order. People had to adapt quickly to new governments, legal systems, and societal norms. This sense of dislocation and instability contributed to political extremism, social unrest, and the eventual rise of radical ideologies in multiple countries. In sum, the collapse of the imperial map after World War I was a defining moment in modern history. The fall of the Romanovs, Hohenzollerns, Habsburgs, and Ottomans fundamentally altered political, social, economic, and cultural structures across Europe and the Middle East. Borders were redrawn, populations displaced, economies fragmented, and social orders transformed. The old certainties of imperial rule were gone, replaced by fragile nation-states grappling with the immense challenges of post-war reconstruction. If Europe was not already broken by the guns, bombs, and trenches of World War I, it was shattered further by an invisible enemy, the 1918 influenza pandemic, commonly called the Spanish flu. This epidemic followed soldiers home from the front lines and spread across the globe with terrifying speed. Historians estimate that the virus infected 1/3 of the world's population, killing between 50 and 100 million people, more than the total death toll of the Great War itself. The combination of war and disease created a perfect storm of demographic, social, and psychological devastation that would haunt the post-war world for decades. The first critical factor in the pandemic spread was the unprecedented movement of troops. Millions of soldiers traveled from one continent to another, crammed into transport ships, trains, and crowded encampments. These movements were unavoidable. Armies had to be redeployed to maintain territorial control, enforce occupation, and suppress uprisings. Soldiers were often malnourished, exhausted, and suffering from lingering war injuries. Their immune systems were weakened, making them particularly susceptible to the influenza virus. Once infected, soldiers carried the virus back to their homes, military bases, and civilian populations, ensuring a rapid global transmission that no public health system could contain. Military camps and trenches created ideal conditions for viral spread. Soldiers lived shoulder to shoulder in poorly ventilated barracks, often sleeping on straw or muddy ground. Sanitation was minimal. Latrines overflowed, water sources were contaminated, and hygiene was difficult to maintain. In such conditions, a virus could move from one person to another with astonishing speed. The Spanish flu exploited these weaknesses, turning the very infrastructure of war into a vector for global catastrophe. Crowded hospital wards struggled to contain the disease, further increasing mortality rates. Once the soldiers returned home, they inadvertently carried the virus to civilian populations. Ports, railway stations, and urban centers became hotspots. Cities that had been relatively safe before the war now faced mass infection. Industrial centers, where workers returned to factories after years of disrupted labor, became prime grounds for the virus to spread. Public gatherings, celebrations, and even the relief efforts following the armistice unintentionally facilitated transmission. Entire towns and neighborhoods were ravaged in a matter of weeks, overwhelming local health services and creating panic among civilians. The demographic impact of the Spanish flu was staggering. Like the war, it targeted young, healthy adults, particularly those between 20 and 40 years old, the same age group, that had borne the brunt of the battlefield losses. In many countries, the combined toll of war and disease wiped out a significant portion of the male population in their prime. Families lost fathers, sons, and brothers in rapid succession, creating what historians sometimes call a lost generation within a lost generation. The societal repercussions were profound. Labor shortages intensified, birth rates declined further, and communities struggled to care for orphans and widows left behind. The pandemic also had far-reaching psychological effects. Survivors faced the dual trauma of wartime violence and an invisible killer that could strike anyone, anywhere. Soldiers returning from the front lines often confronted not only the horrors of combat, but also the grief of losing family and friends to the flu. Entire communities were gripped by fear, uncertainty, and despair. Mental health crises, grief, and post-traumatic stress became widespread, compounding the psychological scars left by 4 years of industrialized slaughter. Economically, the Spanish flu created additional strain on already devastated nations. Governments already bankrupt from the war were forced to divert resources to deal with public health emergencies. Hospitals were overwhelmed, medical personnel were scarce, and pharmaceutical supplies were insufficient. Productivity in factories, farms, and transportation networks collapsed as large portions of the workforce fell ill or died. Trade, already disrupted by the war, suffered further. Countries that had relied on imports and exports to stabilize post-war economies now faced additional shortages, price inflation, and unemployment. In addition, the pandemic exposed weaknesses in public health infrastructure across Europe and the world. Before 1918, modern epidemiology and disease control were still developing. Governments had little experience managing diseases of such scale. Quarantines, travel restrictions, and rudimentary sanitation measures were inconsistent, poorly enforced, or delayed by political and military priorities. Public health communication was primitive, and misinformation spread as rapidly as the virus itself. The result was a tragic combination of unpreparedness and inevitability. The Spanish flu could not be stopped by any single nation, and the global death toll reflects that failure. The timing of the pandemic amplified its impact. The flu arrived as the war ended at a moment when people were already celebrating peace, rebuilding infrastructure, and attempting to resume normal life. Hospitals and cemeteries were already overwhelmed with wartime casualties, and governments struggled to provide basic services to returning soldiers and civilians. The sudden wave of deaths disrupted recovery efforts, delayed economic reconstruction, and fueled social unrest in many countries. Communities that might have started rebuilding were forced to confront another massive loss of life. The pandemic also reshaped public health policy in lasting ways. Governments realized that industrialized warfare and global travel could facilitate the rapid spread of infectious disease. This recognition led to the establishment of more structured public health institutions, improved sanitation standards, and greater attention to medical research and epidemic preparedness. However, these reforms came too late for millions of victims, and the lessons of 1918 were not universally applied, leaving the world vulnerable to future pandemics. Globally, the Spanish flu was not limited to Europe. Troop movements carried the virus across the Atlantic to North America, South America, Africa, and Asia. Indigenous populations in remote areas with little prior exposure to such pathogens experienced catastrophic mortality rates. Entire communities in Canada, Alaska, Australia, and Pacific Islands were devastated. The global nature of the pandemic demonstrated how interconnected the world had become, and how the consequences of European war could ripple outward in unanticipated ways. From an analytical perspective, the Spanish flu illustrates the unintended consequences of total war. Military leaders and politicians focused on territorial gains, strategic victories, and national pride. But these decisions created conditions that facilitated one of the deadliest pandemics in history. Crowded troop movements, poor sanitation in camps, and the general breakdown of civil infrastructure were all direct byproducts of the war. In effect, the war itself created the conditions for a second invisible front one, in which the enemy was not a foreign army, but a microscopic virus exploiting human vulnerability. The pandemic also demonstrated how intertwined human systems are. Political decisions, military strategy, and public health were all connected. The collapse of empires, the movement of populations, and the economic devastation from the war directly influenced the spread and lethality of the influenza virus. In this sense, the Spanish flu was not just a natural disaster. It was amplified and intensified by the very structures and failures that had fueled the Great War. In conclusion, the 1918 influenza pandemic was an integral part of the aftermath of World War I. It compounded demographic losses, weakened already fragile economies, and inflicted a psychological toll on societies struggling to recover. The epidemic exposed the vulnerabilities of human systems under extreme stress, highlighted the global consequences of war, and reshaped the trajectory of public health policy for decades. Europe and much of the world emerged from 1918 not just battered by military defeat and political collapse, but also scarred by a viral catastrophe that claimed millions more lives than the guns and trenches ever could. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, was supposed to end the First World War and create lasting peace in Europe. In practice, it did almost the opposite. Instead of resolving tensions, it planted the seeds for future conflict, creating an environment ripe for political extremism, social unrest, and economic collapse. The treaty's decisions were driven more by national pride, revenge, and the desire to punish Germany than by any strategic vision for long-term stability. One of the treaty's most infamous clauses was Article 231, commonly referred to as the War Guilt Clause. This statement placed full responsibility for the war squarely on Germany's shoulders. It forced the nation to accept blame for a conflict that had involved multiple powers and complex alliances. By labeling Germany as the sole aggressor, the treaty stigmatized the nation, humiliated its citizens, and created a narrative of victimhood that German political extremists would later exploit. National pride and honor, already deeply tied to military tradition, were shattered. Alongside moral blame came severe economic penalties. Germany was required to pay reparations totaling billions of gold marks to the Allied powers. These payments were intended to compensate for wartime damage, but were economically devastating. Germany's industrial base had already been weakened by 4 years of war, and now it was expected to extract resources from an exhausted population. Factories and infrastructure were struggling to resume production, yet a massive financial burden was imposed, creating chronic economic instability. Inflation skyrocketed, wages stagnated, and the standard of living plummeted. The treaty also redrew borders across Europe, stripping Germany of valuable territory. Provinces like Alsace-Lorraine were returned to France. The Saar Basin came under League of Nations control, and other regions were ceded to Poland and Belgium. These territorial losses were not only economically significant, reducing coal and iron production, but also psychologically damaging. Citizens felt humiliated and betrayed, as if their nation had been carved up without consideration of the people living there. These changes sowed the seeds of national resentment that would later feed extremist movements. Beyond Germany, the treaty dismantled empires and created new states, often without regard for historical, ethnic, or cultural realities. Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and parts of Russia were dismembered. New countries like Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Poland were established, but many of these borders ignored the complex mosaic of ethnic and religious groups. Minorities within these new states felt marginalized, leading to tension, civil unrest, and local conflicts. The resulting political instability further destabilized a continent already exhausted by war. Economically, the treaty's punishments were crippling. Germany's reparations required payment in gold and resources, forcing the government to borrow heavily from foreign banks, particularly from the United States. This created a cycle of debt that left Germany vulnerable to financial crises. By 1923, hyperinflation destroyed the value of the German mark, wiping out the savings of ordinary citizens and fueling social unrest. Middle-class families who had survived the war now found themselves impoverished and desperate, seeking scapegoats for their suffering. The treaty's enforcement mechanisms also exacerbated instability. Allied occupation of the Rhineland and monitoring of Germany's military restrictions bred resentment among soldiers and civilians alike. The German army was limited in size and capability, yet the people continued to face economic hardship and territorial insecurity. Many Germans viewed the treaty as a national humiliation imposed by foreign powers, not a negotiated peace. The perception that Germany had been unfairly treated became a central rallying point for nationalist movements, and future leaders like Adolf Hitler. Internationally, the treaty failed to create a system that could enforce lasting peace. The League of Nations, envisioned as the institution that would prevent future wars, was weak and largely ineffective. It lacked the authority, resources, and universal support necessary to resolve conflicts. The United States, despite President Wilson's central role in proposing the League, ultimately refused to join. Without real enforcement power, the treaty's punitive measures were symbolic rather than stabilizing, leaving grievances festering across Europe. The social consequences of the treaty were equally profound. German society, already traumatized by years of war, faced political polarization and ideological radicalization. Communists, socialists, and right-wing nationalists all competed for influence. Claiming to restore the country's honor and protect citizens from further humiliation, veterans returning from the front lines felt betrayed, believing their sacrifices had been nullified by a treaty that punished their nation rather than securing lasting security. Political assassinations, coups, and street violence became common as factions struggled to assert control. In addition to social unrest, the treaty created a climate ripe for extremist propaganda. Nationalists and future fascist leaders used the treaty's harsh terms as evidence of betrayal by weak democratic governments, blaming civilian politicians for Germany's suffering. This stab-in-the-back myth, combined with economic hardship, created fertile ground for Hitler's rise to power in the 1930s. What was intended as a diplomatic settlement to secure peace instead became a propaganda tool for anti-democratic movements. The Treaty of Versailles also failed to provide mechanisms for economic recovery, while the reparations were intended to fund reconstruction in Allied countries. They ignored the interdependence of European economies. Germany's economic collapse had ripple effects across the continent, destabilizing Austria, Hungary, and other nations tied to trade and banking networks. When Germany defaulted or struggled to pay, Allied economies suffered and international tensions rose. The treaty, in trying to punish one nation, destabilized the entire post-war economic system. From an analytical perspective, the Treaty of Versailles serves as a textbook example of how peace settlements can sow the seeds of future conflict when they prioritize revenge over reconciliation. It created a rigid, punitive structure that ignored underlying economic, social, and political realities. By humiliating Germany, destabilizing Europe economically, and creating unresolved ethnic tensions in newly formed states, the treaty ensured that unresolved grievances would fester. The peace it created was fragile, temporary, and ultimately counterproductive. The long-term consequences were clear within 2 decades. The conditions created by Versailles directly facilitated the rise of fascist regimes in Germany, Italy, and elsewhere. Hitler's nationalist and expansionist agenda drew legitimacy from the treaty's perceived injustice. The economic collapse and hyperinflation of the 1920s further radicalized populations, making extremist ideologies attractive to those who had lost faith in traditional governments. In this sense, the treaty did not just fail to prevent another war, it guaranteed one. Furthermore, the Treaty of Versailles illustrates the limits of top-down diplomacy when divorced from practical realities. World leaders like Woodrow Wilson, David Lloyd George, and Georges Clemenceau negotiated the treaty with competing national interests and personal ambitions, often ignoring local realities and expert advice. Clemenceau sought revenge and security for France. Lloyd George wanted electoral gains at home, and Wilson championed ideals that few other powers fully embraced. The result was a compromise that satisfied no one and antagonized the very nation it most needed to reintegrate into the European system. The psychological impact on Germany cannot be overstated. For millions of ordinary citizens, the treaty represented humiliation, injustice, and an existential threat to national identity. The narrative of victimization fueled nationalist mythology, shaping education, political discourse, and media narratives for years to come. Generations were raised to view the Versailles Treaty as a symbol of betrayal and oppression, further entrenching grievances that extremist leaders would later exploit. In conclusion, the Treaty of Versailles serves as a stark lesson in the dangers of punitive diplomacy. By imposing extreme reparations, enforcing territorial losses, and assigning total blame to Germany, the treaty created economic hardship, political instability, and social resentment. It failed to provide mechanisms for genuine reconciliation, instead fostering the rise of extremist ideologies and guaranteeing the outbreak of another, even more destructive war just 2 decades later. The legacy of Versailles demonstrates that a peace settlement that ignores economic, social, and political realities is not a solution, it is a seed for future conflict. For more analysis of how political miscalculations and failed diplomacy shaped modern history, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian. In the next series, we will explore how these unresolved tensions and economic instabilities directly influenced the geopolitical landscape of the 1930s, setting the stage for World War II.